We're working our way through the letter to the Hebrews. We don't know who wrote it. We know who it was addressed to. It was addressed to first century Jewish Christians. We know some things about first century Jewish Christians. That chronic hardship eroded the faith of some of them. As a result, some were abandoning their embraced Christian faith and were going back into Judaism to be able to re-enter the social network and the financial network that was in place as part of Jewish synagogues. Those who were remaining in the Christian church, who were Jews, were washing their hands of contact with these deserters, and the writer to this letter takes them through in chapter 11 to the Hall of Fame, the Faith Hall of Fame in Hebrews 11, and in Hebrews 12, which we will look at this morning. He applies this tour to their faith journey and to ours, if we would see ourselves as followers of Christ. Now look what it says. We'll work our way through the passage. There's a folder insert with your with the verse in it. It begins. It says, "And all these, the individuals in the Faith Hall of Fame, having gained approval through their faith, did not receive what was promised, because God had provided something better for us, so that apart from us, they would not be made perfect." One thing about God's purposes and plans is that He purposes and plans intergenerationally. And what that meant then, when God was dealing with BC individuals, He was thinking of AD consequences of what He would do with BC individuals. God doesn't just judge the value of an act by what it accomplishes now. He judges an act by what it will accomplish generations from now, centuries from now. That's why it says in the Bible in 1 Corinthians, judge nothing before the appointed time. Wait till the Lord comes. He will bring to light what is hidden in darkness and will expose the motives of men's hearts. At that time, each will receive his praise from God. We really can't determine the value of things that happen just by looking at them today. That's not how God judges things. There might be something that looks not very spectacular, not very glorious, but there's a seed being planted, and in centuries to come, that seed will blossom. And that's the way God judges things. If something is spectacular and wonderful, it might be wonderful centuries from now, but it might not be. And that's good news for us if you feel like your faith is kind of modest and you don't see a lot of things happening in and through it. It's too early to determine the relative value of what we are experiencing individually or corporately. We won't know the value of something within the span of our lives. And God looks at it what it means. So God plans intergenerationally. Faithfulness has intergenerational ripple effects. So somebody faithful in this generation could have ripple effects into the next generation. The same thing with faithlessness. In ancient Judaism, we find, both in the Old Testament, we find Old Testament Hall of Faith members, Hall of Fame, and we also find Hall of Shame members. If you have your worship folder, there is an insert. I started and have not completed wrote some things, one it felt like for, if we want to understand things, the books that are helpful to understand, essential to understand, I would say. Hebrews, Romans, Galatians, and 2 Corinthians. Those four, they detail in Paul's view of grace and how it applies to us and churches, etc., etc. Also started in John and haven't finished that, but that's the face of grace, and all of those sound the same. So Hebrews is the base of grace, and Romans is the case for grace, and Galatians is the race for grace, and 2 Corinthians is the vase for grace, and John is the face of grace. And so you can say, Mike, why don't you stop there? I'm getting tired of the alliteration. Anyways, the face of grace, when Jesus deals with the Samaritan woman, read along with, I'll read it and you can follow along. Where does the power to live godly lives come from? God's promises empower us to live godly lives when we place our faith in them. Sir, the woman said, from John, I can see that you are a prophet. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain. But you Jews claim that the place where we must worship is in Jerusalem. In Jesus' day, there was bad blood between the Jews who lived in the south of Israel and the Samaritans who lived in the north. The rift was created by the disbelief of King Jeroboam, a millennium earlier, and the idolatrous religious practices his reign inaugurated. He ordered the construction of pagan shrines that continued to create problems in Jesus' day. The Samaritan woman alluded to these shrines when she admitted to Jesus, our fathers worshipped on this mountain. But you Jews claim that the place where we must worship is in Jerusalem. Following the reign of King Solomon, Israel split into a northern kingdom called Israel and a southern kingdom called Judah. Rehoboam became king of the southern kingdom of Judah. Jeroboam became king of the northern kingdom of Israel. In giving Jeroboam control over the northern kingdom, God made him a promise. If you do whatever I command you, and walk in my ways, and do what is right in my eyes, by keeping my statutes and commands, as David, my servant, did, I will be with you. I will build you a dynasty as enduring as the one I built for David, and will give Israel to you. When his subjects headed south to make annual pilgrimages to attend the prescribed religious festivals, Jeroboam lost sight of God's promise. Jeroboam thought to himself, the kingdom will now likely revert to the house of David. If these people go up to offer sacrifices at the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem, they will again give their allegiance to their Lord, Rehoboam, king of Judah. They will kill me and return to King Jeroboam. Jeroboam's belief led to disobedience. In order to keep his subjects at home, he, the king, made 2 golden calves. He said to the people, it is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt. One he set up in Bethel, and the other in Dan. And this thing became a sin. The people went even as far as Dan to worship the one there. The sad legacy of Jeroboam is that the kings who followed in his wake walked in all the ways of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, and in his sin. Jeroboam never imagined that letting go of God's promises would have such a devastating impact. His disbelief led to pervasive idolatry, captivity, and to the eventual assimilation of the northern Jews into the pagan culture of surrounding nations. It's easy for us to forget that the power to live the Christian life resides in God's promises. Peter writes, his divine power has given us everything we need for life and godliness through our knowledge of him, who called us by his own glory and goodness. Through these he has given us his very great and precious promises, so that through them you may participate in the divine nature, through them being promises, and through these same promises escape the corruption in the world caused by evil desires. God's very great and precious promises provide us with everything we need for life and godliness. Believing in God's promises enables us to participate in the divine nature and escape the corruption in the world caused by evil desires. God's promises, however, don't benefit those who don't believe them. In sharp contrast to the legacy of Jeroboam, the writer draws attention to the members of the Faith Hall of Fame. And what he does, he applies the image to a race and implies that these Hall of Faith members who lived in the Old Testament passed the baton to these ones who are walking at the time of this writing, which would be in the first century. They passed off the baton to these first century Jewish Christians. And he writes about this, he likens it to an athletic contest, to a marathon or a race in the Olympic Games, which began at the time. Look what it says in 12:1. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured from sinners such hostility against himself, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted. The image is of a crowd of spectators in a stadium watching an athletic contest. They are the witnesses. They are looking at this athletic event, and this athletic event requires that those who are participating run with endurance, the race that is set out for them. He could very well be thinking of a marathon or a distance race. The writer encourages first century Christians who he sees as in this race, keep going, keep running. This is the nature of encouragement, by the way. If you want an image of encouragement, it is those who they see that somebody is involved in something that requires some endurance, and they come alongside to encourage the person to keep going, keep at it, don't stop, keep going. And that's what the writer is encouraging with these first century Christians. He provides a specific encouragement. He says, let us lay aside every weight and the sin that so easily entangles. There's a lot of weights. There's a lot of burdens that could be carried. And what the writer is kind of identifying is the possibility that some of the runners have been saddled with a weight that impedes their ability to run with endurance the race that is set out. If you're running a race and you have a backpack loaded with stuff, it's going to impede your ability to run the race with endurance. You're going to get tired. It's an unnecessary burden. There's a lot of unnecessary burdens, but first century Jewish Christians, there is a particular one that Peter spoke of and Jesus spoke about. And when Peter and Jesus refused to put this burden on, it created problems for them. But Peter says, actually Jesus first, Jesus says, come to me all who labor and are heavy laden, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. When Jesus talks about being heavy laden, there's an image in mind. But I want you to picture a pack mule. Got a pack mule with a load of stuff on its back. And not just a little load, but just picture this, a mountain of things on the back of this pack mule. And the pack mule goes and the load goes, oh, and it's obviously heavy laden. And what Jesus is describing, that's who he's talking to. He sees people managing that type of unmanageable burden. And this is what he says, come to me, you who are weary and heavy laden. He ends up saying, take my yoke upon you and learn from me. We've talked about this. A yoke is the word given to putting an animal, putting its head through a kind of a fixture that allows it to draw farm implements behind. That's one thing, that's one way that we understand yoke, but that's probably not what they're thinking of. When Jesus says, take my yoke, when you were a rabbi, those students who sat at your feet to learn from you, they took upon themselves the yoke of the rabbi. And so what yoke meant within the context of education, it's if you sat at the feet of someone and your goal was to think like they think, you were taking the yoke of the rabbi upon yourself. So here's what Jesus is saying. They had been sitting at the feet of individuals who were teaching them you have to do everything prescribed in the law of Moses and in the Old Commandment and Old Covenant. Jesus didn't come to enforce the Old Covenant. In fact, what he came to do is replace it, to replace the law of Moses with the New Covenant. And that's what he came to do. And what he's saying to those who were laden with the weight of kind of accommodating the laws in the Old Covenant, where Jesus says, stop. Take my yoke upon you. What Jesus is saying, I want you to see God as I see him. I want you to worship God as I worship him. Let aside the yoke that you have been placing and take my yoke upon you. Peter said something similar. Acts 15, he says, now therefore, speaking to those who wanted to force those who were embracing Christ to take upon themselves all the laws that ancient Jews had been keeping, here's what Peter says, why do you put God to the test by placing on the necks of the disciples a yoke which neither our fathers nor we have been able to bear? The encouragement to lay aside every encumbrance had to do with don't place yourself under the burden that comes from trying to make God happy by keeping the commandments and fearing that you displease him by not doing so. Now, does that mean we get to do whatever we want? No. But what Jesus would indicate, the ability to love him and one another does not happen when you are managing the load of religious obligations. This will not lead to love. It will lead to fatigue and weariness and blaming. In encouraging their endurance, he chooses a peculiar focus. Look what it says in verse 4. So he's going to encourage them to keep running. And this is what he says. In your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. And you have forgotten the exhortation that addresses you as sons and daughters. My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor be weary when reproved by him. For the Lord disciplines the one he loves, and chastises every son whom he receives. It is for discipline that you have to endure. God is treating you as sons. Our experience in the world colors the way we understand words. Our experience with Father affects the way we understand the Bible when it says, you are sons and daughters of your Father. The same thing with discipline. We all have experience with discipline. I remember a couple of things. My mother did discipline pretty well in some cases and not so well in others. So I had a really bad habit that none of you do. I would go into the, and it really is pathetic. I would go into the refrigerator, and where there was a box, when there was a bottle of milk or pop, I'd just guzzle it. So okay. So anyways, here's my mother did once. So I'm there, and I'm caught red-handed with this bottle up in my mouth, and then my mother says, okay, this is what you're going to do. I want you to pour the rest of that bottle out. Thinking, I already got all I wanted to drink, and so I don't understand why this is. So it's not a great discipline. She did a better one. I stayed out all night one night, and I forgot to call her. And I'll never forget it. And I never did it again. I was walking up the driveway the next morning, and I saw her face in the window. She had been sitting there all night. And I got in the door, and she looked at me and didn't say a word, and then walked upstairs. I never did that again. We have different experiences with discipline, and these experiences affect our understanding. We apply this to God as well. The word discipline, it comes from two Greek words that are stuffed together. One word for child, and the other word to be with. What discipline then literally is, it's to be with a child. That's what it is. And it's not so much about formal education. That's not the sense for discipline. The instilling of values and norms of conduct by verbal means. So what discipline is training a child by telling them, this is what we value. Is that me, or? Okay, smoke alarm, okay. That is a very clever way to remind you that we will have a meal after the service. And so, isn't that appealing? Now you're thinking of what's happening. Okay, anyway. Okay, just... Okay. Good luck with this. Maybe we could close those doors back there. Oh, it's right there. Thank you. Thank you, John. Okay, so where were we? Not so much about formal education. It was about communicating the values that you want the children to espouse, and it also includes the kind of maybe some punishment if those rules or norms weren't ascribed to. But the sense for discipline, it's not punishment, it's training. So what we need to understand about discipline, and there's 2 points I'll make this morning, maybe you could walk out with them, the motive of discipline and the focus of discipline. The first is motive. The motive of biblical discipline is love, not wrath. That's the truth. It's love, not wrath. We think of discipline, we think, I'll get even. That's not the word. It's not about getting even. It's about being with the child and influencing the child in such a way that the child will do the things that the child will be benefited if they do. That's the sense for discipline. There's 2 responses that the writer warns against. He says, don't make light and don't lose heart. Making light of God's discipline. If you were disciplined growing up, you become an adolescent. And so you really want to get your mother's goat. I don't think I did this specific thing. But if your mother was a corporal discipline person who whacked you with a hand or with a spoon or with a tree branch or with a whip or whatever it was, and so she'd do that, and then the way to really do this, I think I might have done it once. I wasn't a wise guy, but I think I probably went into wise guyness at one thing. What is that, mosquitoes? I mean, if you make light of discipline and say, what, is that the best you got? Don't do that. You know, that's making light of discipline. It's treating as if it's no big deal. And so anybody ever do that? Anybody out there? Come on, there you go. I knew it. It's kind of like it's a way to pretend that didn't even get me, that didn't even bother me. The other side is to lose heart. Lose heart when you're disciplined. I remember we disciplined Gavin once, and then he was maybe 2, 3, or 4, I forget how old he was, and this is what he said, I'll never forget it. You hurt all of my feelings. So what's happening, there's 2 different groups of people. One group is heading back into Judaism because the things they're experiencing are very difficult and they are losing heart. They're saying, I can't do this anymore. So they're bugging out and going back to the synagogue. The ones that are staying, they make light of God's discipline. They say, wait, what's the deal? This is not hard at all. So what the writer says, he's kind of encouraging them, don't do either. Don't dismiss the difficulty and don't be crushed by it. Now, this is what it's describing. These individuals are experiencing difficult things. To make light of it would be, well, I need to just thank God because God loves me and he's good. Okay, God loves us, but he's good. But you know what he does? He disciplines us. He puts us in difficult circumstances. And if you smile during those circumstances, it's like saying, what, mosquitoes? It's making light of it. Discipline is painful. And if you're going through something difficult, it's not a lack of faith to saying, you know what, I'm kind of struggling right now. In fact, it might be a lack of faith not to say it. To pretend that everything's fine. Everything's not fine. What it describes here, if you're not undergoing discipline, if there are things in your life that aren't difficult, that's not a reason to smile. It's a reason to be concerned. And this, the writer says, if you lack discipline, we all lack discipline. Then he says, if you lack it, you're illegitimate children. If God cares about you and if you are his, you are going to experience some turbulence. And it's not because you're out of the will of God. It's because you're in it. And discipline is the means whereby God expresses, well, okay, yeah, so the one side would be to make light of it. The other side would be to lose heart. And that's what's happening by the ones that are leaving, they're losing heart. The ones that are staying are making light. He says in verse 7, it is for discipline that you have to endure. This doesn't seem very encouraging, but here's the point. These individuals feel abandoned and alone. And he's asking them to chalk up the sufferings to the presence of divine involvement, not the absence of divine involvement. I want you to listen to what he says. The things that are happening to them that are difficult, what he's saying, it's not because God is not involved with your life. It's because he is. The things that are happening to you, the difficulties, the relational difficulties, what he said, the financial difficulties, that's not about God not being involved in your life. It's about God being involved in your life. It's for discipline that you endure. These individuals are saying, why in the world should I stay in this? Why should I keep going? And then the writer gives them a reason. It's for discipline. There's a story, I think I've told you this before. A guy who was told by God, there's this huge rock. And he was told, push against the rock. So he did. He's pushing against the rock. And he's pushing against the rock and pushing against the rock, and day follows day, and he's pushing against the rock, and the rock's not going anywhere. And he finally comes up to the place where he says, this is stupid. Why should I continue to push on this rock? And he stops pushing on the rock, and naturally that's when God comes by. And God says, what are you doing? And he says, well, I'm not pushing on the rock anymore, and because the rock's not going anywhere. Well, God says to him, it wasn't about moving the rock. I want you to look at your back now. And God looks at his back. I want you to see the development in your back, the strength in your back, the muscles in your back. Pushing was not about moving the rock. It was about what pushing on the rock did for you. How it strengthened your ability, how it strengthened you physically, and also how it strengthens us emotionally and strengthens us spiritually. They say that fear is the natural response to a perceived threat. When we're threatened by something, fear is the natural response to a perceived threat. Anxiety is the natural response to facing it alone. Here's what God, you're encountering some things that are fearful. What God would have you understand is that, sure, it's difficult what you're facing. But what God is trying to tell these individuals and us across the centuries is that Okay, but don't be anxious because you're not facing it alone. That's the sense. It's the things that they are incurring, the things that they are dealing with are not about the absence of divine involvement, but the presence of it. The motive of discipline is love, not wrath, and the focus of discipline is the future, not the past. Look what it says in halfway through verse 7. For what son is there whom his father does not discipline? If you are left without discipline, in which all have participated, then you are illegitimate children and not sons. Besides this, we have had earthly fathers who disciplined us, and we respected them. Shall we not much more be subject to the Father of spirits and live? For they disciplined us for a short time, as it seemed best to them. But he disciplines us for our good, that we may share his holiness. For the moment, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant, but later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. Therefore, lift your drooping hands and strengthen your weak knees. Make straight paths for your feet, so that what is lame may not be put out of joint, but rather healed. The motive of discipline is love, not wrath. I'm going to tell you one more thing then, and maybe you can remember this. It's about the focus of discipline. The focus of discipline is on the future, not the past. The focus of discipline is on the future, not the past. When we think of discipline, we think of something that I did and God's getting even with me. I got angry or I made a mistake and God punished me in order to kind of balance the scales. That's not what discipline's about. It's not about correcting something that you did. It's about promoting the ability to do something positive and correct in the future. It's developing a positive thing. And those are a little bit, if you've ever gone to a gym, it talks about for those who have been trained by it. Train comes from the word from which we get the word gymnazo, which is the word gymnasium. And it says discipline is a way to train. Now, if you've gone to the gym, you'll see people, and it really looks like they're being tortured. You ever see anybody, they're on the weight machines, and, you've seen it, right? It's like, and boy, give that guy some relief. But why is the woman putting themselves through that? It's to remove what's unwanted and to gain what's wanted. To remove excess weight, to replace it with muscle. That's what discipline does. It's not just about taking away anger. It's about promoting endurance. It's not just taking away what is unwanted. It's developing what is wanted. That's the sense with divine discipline. It says in verse 10, for they disciplined us for a short time as it seemed best to them, but he disciplines us for our good, that we may share in his holiness. God disciplines us for our good. Good is a relative term. We talked about this before. Depending on who you're asking, good will mean something different. And the question becomes, what does good mean when God uses it? When we think of good, good means I get what I want and keep what I have. Do you agree? Good is, I get what I want, I keep what I have. And to God, what's God's definition of good? That we get what we want and keep what we have. It says God works out all things together for good. If I follow God, will he give me the ability to get what I want and keep what I have? It gives a definition for good here. We've talked about this before, but this is an interesting definition. Look what it says. Verse 10, God disciplines us for our good. And look what it says right after that. It gives a definition for good. God disciplines us for our good, that we may share in his holiness. So here's the deal. Good to God means when we go through difficult things that allow us to share in his holiness. What does that mean? Holiness, look what it says in verse 12. Therefore, lift your drooping hands and strengthen your weak knees and make straight paths for your feet, so that what is lame may not be put out of joint, but rather healed. Here's the picture that it's painting. There's a group of people, and they're moving forward. There are people that are lagging at the back. They are not able to keep up with the crowd. And there are people falling back because they're clearing the path so that these individuals who are lame will not stumble and further hurt themselves, which is an interesting image of holiness. When we think about holiness, we usually think about somebody who leads the pack in spiritual discipline, and they read the Bible more, and they pray more, and they fast more, and they give more. And we think about holiness being out in front of the group, but that's not the image given here. Holiness is not demonstrated out in front of the group, it's demonstrated behind. Not looking ahead, but looking back. Who is stumbling? Who's not able to keep up? I need to hang back in case somebody who's not able to keep up, I need to come alongside them. That's what the writer is trying to encourage here. Because here's what's happening. There are Jewish Christians who are falling behind and are falling by the wayside. And those who are remaining, good riddance. And there's reasons they feel that way. And what the writer is saying, no. Don't do that. Good to God means to share in His holiness. And what that means, don't leave them behind. Try to do what you can. Listen, man, don't give up. Don't go back to that. Come on, I'll walk with you. I'll run with you. We'll run together. I always think of that story. Think of JC. JC had asthma. And he was playing basketball, and they needed to run a mile in a prescribed time. And so he's having a hard time. So what they did, they boxed him in. And some ran out in front of him, and some ran behind him, and they paced him. Keep going, man. Keep going. Keep it up. That's, you know what they were doing? You know what that's an image of? Holiness. It's not, come on. Holiness is not evaluating somebody. It's not, man. Holiness is coming alongside somebody. Come on, let's go. Come on, let's go. Don't stop. That's what and you know who ends up being able to do something like that? If you've got no problems, you don't have much compassion. If you get what you want and keep what you have, you just want to keep sailing. But if you can't, if you're struggling, if you have pain, if you're dealing with difficulties, you know what that means? Somebody else is stumbling, you know what that feels like. Don't you? God puts us in places where we experience painful things so that we'll be able to be mindful of those who are not keeping up and come alongside them. That's what holiness is. Discipline produces holiness, and discipline is painful. It says, for the moment, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant, but later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness. And it just gives a little, very quickly. Let's just look at this verse and we'll eat together. Hopefully, if you can stay. Deuteronomy 8, it gives a little sense for what's discipline feel like. What does God do? Look what it says in Deuteronomy 8. Remember how the Lord your God led you all the way in the desert these 40 years? He humbled you, causing you to hunger, and then feeding you with manna, which neither you nor your fathers had known, to teach you that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. Your clothes did not wear out, and your feet did not swell during these 40 years. Know then, in your heart that as a man disciplines his son, so the Lord your God disciplines you. God led them to a place without food and water. Why would he do that? And they didn't believe that God did that. What they did, they blamed Moses because they said it's Moses' fault. But it wasn't Moses' fault. The cloud moved when God wanted them to move, and it stopped when he wanted them to stop. And it stopped in places where there was no water. God would never lead a person to a place where there was no water or food, would he? Would he? He does. He does. That's what happened. He led them to a place where there was no water. Why would he do something like that? So that they would learn not just to tune in their stomachs, but to tune in his words. If you're full and if you have everything you want, you really don't need to listen to God. You really don't. If, though, your stomach is empty and you have challenges, what ends up happening, we end up tuning God in. And that's what it's describing. He put them in places so that they would learn that man doesn't live by bread alone, but on everything that comes from the mouth of God. You know what we end up doing? And we end up, if we don't understand discipline, we do end up blaming people. Like they blamed Moses. They believed the reason why we're in a waterless place is Moses dropped the ball. But Moses didn't drop the ball. It was ultimately him. And when we forget that, we can blame others. It's my husband's fault. Now, there might be things. It's my wife's fault. It's my kid's fault. It's my fault that I don't have what I want and keep what I have. Just telling you, it's not about something that's wrong. Now, it doesn't feel good. Now, don't pretend. When you're in a difficult place, don't pretend that it's fine. It's not. You can say, it doesn't feel good. But it doesn't feel good is different than it isn't good. Do you know the difference between those? You understand it? It doesn't feel good. What's that? That's an observation. Things don't feel good. You know, that's just a fact. Something that doesn't feel good, that means that it isn't good, right? Right? If it doesn't feel good, it isn't good. Some of you are shaking your head no. And that's correct. Because in God's, the way God does things, something that doesn't feel good accomplishes a good end. That we share in his holiness. Little story about a father who, it was wintertime, and this bird had fallen and was kind of thrashing around. He tried to pick the bird up, but the bird struggled against his hands. He wanted to try to nurse it or do something, felt bad about it. This bird was just flipping around on the ground, and the bird was struggling so much against his hands that he had to let it go. And later on, he had to jump back in the car, and in fact, he was on his way with his daughter. She was getting a shot. And so they came into the doctor's office, and she didn't like shots, like a number of us don't like shots. And anyways, so what she ended up doing, she ended up throwing her arms around her father's neck. And just did that until the shot was administered. And then this father was thinking later on that night, when we struggle, how often are we more like wounded birds than wounded children with respect to God? We struggle in his hands rather than go to him and throw our arms around him and say, God, this doesn't feel good. Give me what I need. Help me to keep going. That's what the writer to the letter is trying to encourage in these people. Brett, come on, let's sing out the song. Pray for us. God, we come away from this text identifying a couple things. When we think of discipline, a lot of different things enter our minds. But for you, discipline means to come alongside a child, and you would have us understand a couple of things with respect to discipline, its motive and its focus. The motive of discipline is love, not anger. It's not you balancing the scales by punishing. That's not what it is. It's not motivated by wrath. It's motivated by love. And the focus of discipline is not on the past. It's not, you did this, and so now I'm going to do this. It's focused on the future, on what we'll be able to do as your sons and daughters, and what we'll be able to reflect in our world. Thanks for that, in Jesus' name. Amen.